thank you for your attention thus far. You folks are really lucky, as am I, because now we get to hear from Professor Mark Henderson. And Mark teaches at Mills College and has for quite some years. And in fact, I have read the 2 articles that I think you've been asked to consume as well, because I'm on the board for Education About Asia. So the article they wrote in 2004 talked about experiential learning and field trips, taking students to China and that sort of thing. And then this more recent article looks at being able to do that using web resources and others. And so we are extremely fortunate to have Mark Henderson, who's a professor of public policy. And it's important to keep in mind the many ways in which we interact with China. And we talk about economics and we talk about presidential summits and things like that, but we interact on many other levels. City planning, all environmental degradation, trying to mitigate that, and to do other kinds of things, such as involves healthcare. You're going to be hearing more about that later today, but a wide variety of subjects. So prior to his service in academia, Mark helped to improve the United States by being a staffer at the Environmental Protection Agency, an endangered species these days, okay? So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Mark Henderson.
Thanks for the warm welcome, and wasn't that a lovely presentation this morning? You could have listened all day and still had more to learn. So thank you, Clay, for this morning and for that welcome. Again, my name's Mark Henderson. I teach at Mills College across the bay in Oakland, California, which many of you may know as a historically women's college. I want to put a little asterisk on that to say that we were the first women's college to open a transgender-friendly admissions policy a few years back, and that our graduate programs, including my own Master Public Policy program, has been co-ed from the beginning. So if you've got promising young students who would like a small liberal arts college in the Bay Area, that sort of experience for their undergraduate or graduate years, I hope you'll consider sending them my way. I'm here to talk under this umbrella of China, globalization, and the environment, and we got started talking about the topic of globalization in Clay's talk this morning. I think it's pretty obvious that you can't talk or you can't understand China today without wrestling with this concept of or phenomenon of globalization, and you certainly can't understand globalization today without putting China in the center of that conversation. My own area of research is environmental policy, land use and climate change, both in the US and China. And so I'm going to bring that angle into the discussion as a focus. And what I'm hoping is that a few more minutes into my talk, after some introductions and explanations, as many of you who can will open up a Google Chrome browser or the Google Earth app on your laptop or on your phone, downloadable app, and we'll explore some of the places in China and elsewhere in the world that are connected in this web of a global supply chain. And we'll think as we go through those processes by looking down from the sky what the environmental impacts might be on the environmental resources, on the people who live there. And this is an exercise I pioneered with my class at Mills on China, globalization, and the environment a few years back, and then wrote about it in this Education About Asia article a few years ago. And of course, things have changed. The software has all changed, and since then, so we'll do it live. And I'm hoping that for some of you, this is an accessible sort of experience you could share with your students, either as a one-off class exploration or, as I do in my class, group projects, where I have students spend a week tallying the things that they use and where they're from, and then do some research, pick one, work in a group, and trace back where did it come from, where did it pass through, how did all the components get put together and into your hands, and even more so, or in addition, where does it go when you're done with it. All right, so this is a little bit embarrassing, but I was, as I was preparing for this, I actually got a box of old photos from my sister, and that's me in the 70s sometime on a very hot summer day in Sacramento, where I grew up, in a pink plastic swimming pool trying to get cool, and with some of the neighbors from across the street. And this was the point where I was learning to read and at the point where I was just fascinated with words, as kids get to be when they start to recognize words. And somewhere on this pink plastic swimming pool, as I was sitting there in the heat, it said, "Made in Taiwan, ROC." And I spelled that out, and I was like, what's that? And the nice suburban dad from across the street, Mr. Fong, said, "Oh, that's Taiwan, Republic of China." And I said, "Oh, okay, so the swimming pool came from China. That's kind of neat." He said, no, it's not really China. It's Taiwan. There's this other China, and you don't get things from there. It's like, okay. And there, over the years, I got a little bit more of the history of it. Mr. Fong and his family had come over in the 1940s. They still had relatives back in mainland China that they had gone a long time without being able to communicate with at all, and it was only with President Nixon's opening that they started to reconnect. But it was a rare thing to go to China, to connect with China, to get a product from China in the 70s. But not that rare at that point to get some things from Taiwan. And so as a little kid looking for patterns, you start seeing these everywhere, made in Taiwan, ROC, made in Taiwan, on a lot of different kinds of products. And then if you keep looking, this is again the 70s, even more things made in Japan. Okay, so I'm getting just this vague awareness of there are other places, and some things come from those places to Sacramento, California. Japan, of course, it pioneered that economic strategy of export orientation. So it said, rather than doing as, say, the US had done in its early years, trying to block imports and substitute products made domestically, it said, yeah, we'll go ahead and import complicated things and expensive things and highly high-skilled, high-quality things, and we'll export the cheaper things. And we'll engage in trade that way, and we'll build up our economy and our skill, and then later we'll move into things. So by the 70s, the plastic swimming pools were being made in Taiwan, but things like cameras and then some smaller cars and things like that were coming into the American market from Japan. So just in the very vague sense of a student growing up, noticing that things come from different places and that there are patterns with that. As imports from different Asian countries surged through the 70s and into the 80s, we got a little bit more attention. Things that were actually made here. There was a lot of Buy American sentiment, so you might start noticing those. And of course, to make that work, to send more things overseas as well, and imports and exports both rise in this era. We've always imported and exported. Some of our major trading partners are in Europe, Canada, Mexico. Speaking of political statements, do they think that we won't notice that the French, where it says made in China, and made in Canada in English, it says made in Quebec in French? That's kind of funny. But of course, then we start to get the rise of imports from mainland China, the place we didn't get stuff before in the 70s. And it seems everybody, even people you might not expect, are sending their products to be made in China. Why does this happen? Why does it happen when it happens? Well, let's look at the numbers a little bit first, and then we're going to talk about trade in a way that you might bring up in an economics class or social sciences, social studies class. So China's the fattest green line here, and you go back to 1985, which I think is the earliest data I could get from the US Census Bureau here. And it's down at the bottom. It's close to zero imports from mainland China. But we're getting a lot of things from Japan. We're getting more things, actually, at that point from Canada. We start tracking Europe as an entity in the mid-90s and putting all of those countries together. They're our major trading partner. But China climbs consistently, even in the dip in imports in the Great Recession. China doesn't dip as much as everybody else, and soon it's past Mexico, it's past Canada, and we're pretty much importing in dollars about as much as from all of the countries of Europe combined. And in terms of stuff, I love that clip from The Office, because if you look at the number of pieces of things, small items that you find, want to take a bet on this clicker here? I don't see a sticker, but if your students are going to track where things they touch on a daily basis come from, they're going to see China probably more than anything else. So this doesn't come as a surprise to any of you. It may come as a surprise, actually, that the dollars from Japan leveled off to the extent that they did. A lot of stories behind that. Some of it is Japanese companies deciding to build their products in the U.S., just as foreshadowing the U.S. investment in, the Chinese investment in South Carolina car manufacturing. Let's go on to this. This is the Port of Oakland, between down the hill from Mills College and across the bay from here. Something you might want to cover in your classes is this whole discussion of why we trade at all. This is sort of basic economics 101. And then from that, how is this current era of globalization different from the sort of trade that's happened as long as there have been people in different places who could move goods from one place to another? So why do we trade? And the phrase comparative advantage came up this morning. It's the economic jargon for it, but basically somewhere can produce something better, cheaper, faster than you, and you've got something that you can produce better, cheaper, faster than them, and it's your mutual benefit to meet somewhere in the middle and hand them off, and everybody's better off rather than, say, us trying to produce something that they produce really well in Spain or in Denmark or wherever it is. So we do that. Why can places produce things better, cheaper, and faster than other places? Well, they might have natural resource endowments. They've got minerals in the ground. They've got crop growing conditions that make it advantageous to produce that product there. They might have labor advantages. They might have cheaper labor. They might have labor of a certain with certain skills. They might have traditions or a culture of innovation that's made them more productive in developing certain industries. And all of those things together go into the advantage that a country or a region or a company has in trading. So since I teach public policy, I also say, well, there's a policy environment to this too. Different places set up different regimes or sets of rules around trade. They set up tariffs. They charge people money to bring things into their country, taxes. They set up labor regulations and environmental regulations that govern how much you can ask of people or what you can do to the natural environment to produce things in your own country. And other regulations like that that change the incentive structure beyond just the natural resources and the labor pool. So when we think about trade here in California, I like to say that we've been part of a global trade network going back longer than California has been a state. So anyone know some of the first Europeans that came not from the south but from the north down the California coast were the Russians, right? Came down out of Alaska. You can go visit Fort Ross up on the north coast, and they were here to hunt seals. And it's like, okay, they were here to hunt seals and bring them back. Where did they bring them to? Well, some of them probably went to Russia, but a lot of them went to China. And in fact, in the Qing dynasty, a certain level of Qing official wore a robe that was lined in California seal skin or seal fur. And they were getting that from the Russians, who were getting that from California. So we were part of a trans-Pacific trading network back into the 1700s. On the other side of the continent, you remember the story of the Boston Tea Party, key event sparking the American Revolution. Where do you think the tea came from? All right, who was growing tea in that time? So the British were shipping it from China, putting a stamp on it or demanding that Americans pay a tax on it. There's a policy issue there. Americans took objection to this, dumped it into Boston Harbor. The next step in that story after the Revolution is that the first American flagged trading ship was named the Empress of China, and it was going back the other way to get tea and other things from China to bring back without going through those pesky British. Anyone know what we were trading to China at that point? Silver, probably. It was the currency of the time, but a natural grown product in North America that we were trading to China was close. Ginseng. Anybody get that? Okay, and that's still something we have in the forests of North America, or we cultivate and we send back to China. It's still part of our trade balance. All right, so this goes back a long way, and I've even seen an anecdote that in an Inuit archaeological site far in northern Canada, finding beads that were produced in the Tang Dynasty. And we're still not quite sure which way around the pole those beads would have been traded from one to another, but somehow they got there, and presumably some other goods traveled in the opposite direction to make that happen, maybe not the whole way around. So trade's been around a long time, but we have a sense that the global trade, the globalization that we're in now is a different thing than a sealskin or a cask of tea traveling around the world. All right. So why does this happen now? Well, the picture we're looking at here with all of those containers, thousands of standard size steel containers, is a big part of it. From the 50s and especially during the Vietnam War era, the shipping industry settled on this standard unit for putting things in and getting them to places intermodally, putting them on ships, loading them onto trucks, loading them onto trains, whatever you need. And that's greatly increased the efficiency by which we can move bulk goods across around the globe. It also helps that we've been in an era of cheap energy. So you can put them all on a ship and you can power that ship across vast distances at a really low cost per unit once they're standardized like that. So we've got some technological innovation. We just have a green on standards and what size a container is going to go and how you stack them up and transfer them from one place to another. And then another innovation that's sort of behind the scenes, but electronic customs records actually matter. That we agree that rather than having an inspector open up each cask and look at each thing, that most of that inspection of things coming and going from countries is going to be on electronic manifests that can be transmitted at more or less the speed of light and checked off and the tax paid. That speeds things up tremendously so that we can have this constant flow of goods across countries. Then we get credit to some of the Japanese companies for popularizing this, the just-in-time manufacturing rule, that each plant is set up to receive inputs that will come in just so they need them, and they do what they do them, and they pass them on to the next stage in the process. And so that's a process innovation that spreads. And then it stops mattering quite so much where the inputs come from. They can get there pretty fast from anywhere else. You can transfer them to an area that has a comparative advantage in the next thing that needs to be done, whether it's smelting or rolling the material or weaving the cloth, cutting, stamping, assembling on to the consumer. And this comes to an era where it starts to make economic sense, even if it doesn't necessarily make obvious sense to regular old people, to do something like dig bauxite out of the ground in Australia and ship it to Iceland, which is about as far away as you can get from Australia, because they have cheap geothermal power, and turn that bauxite into aluminum, and then ship that to China, where it gets rolled or pressed or put into shape to become whatever we need, and then shipping that back across the world to the US and putting it on store shelves. So the distance that any of your items that you might have purchased routinely isn't just from wherever it says on the sticker, made in such and such a place, but could be 2 or 3 steps behind that, if not more. Okay. So China comes along, back to that graph of their rise in exports, with a policy change and an economic change when they decide they are going to follow on this path of opening up to an export-oriented development strategy. The Chinese Communist Party decides it's okay for some people to get rich first, as their Deng Xiaoping famously says, on the way to opening up the economy. And we get first the special economic zones and then the spread throughout China of manufacturing for the export market. Along the way, the Chinese realize that they are causing some environmental problems, and they need some environmental policies to protect their natural resources, protect the health of the people, and so forth. Just like a lot of other countries. And if you go back in the US in the 50s and 60s, especially up to Earth Day in 1970, we had an awakening that all of this economic progress that we had achieved after World War II was coming at an environmental cost. So this map is attempting to show where different countries are in terms of the performance of their environmental policies to protect health and natural resources. And as you see here, the US and joined with Canada are in the light green. We're pretty good. I think if you took this back a generation, we would have been on the cutting edge of this. And it's interesting that we've slipped behind some of the European countries here in terms of both putting effective environmental policies on the books and also enforcing them. And then China's a step down here in the yellow, but there are other countries that are worse. So China's gone from not having a lot of policies to at first adopting some of the US policies tailored to Chinese conditions, but not enforcing them very well, to now having enough popular demand from people who don't like living next to smokestacks or having their rivers turn whatever color of dye happens to be popular that year, and enforcing with increasing vigor some of the environmental policies. So they're not at the bottom of the barrel by any means, but they are a step below the US and some of the other industrialized countries in terms of what's governed by their policies and what enforcement actually happens. This starts to matter because if you are interested in producing some product that has an environmental negative side effect, a negative externality, you might consider the rules in place in different countries when you decide where to locate your factory. So if you want to produce something that sends a lot of smoke into the air or effluent into the river, and you look into this map, it's like, well, you're not going to go to Sweden because they're just not going to let you do it. And if you go to the US, you might be able to do it, but you got to get a permit, and you might have to pay a lot to clean it up. And if you go to China, you might just be able to do it, or you might have to clean it up, but not quite to the same standard as you would in the US. Or if you go to India or some of the countries in Africa, you might just be able to do this without anyone looking at all. So there's a debate in the environmental policy community over whether this thing exists called the race to the bottom or the race to the dirty bottom. Will companies see this range of policies and decide to locate their processes in a place where they can get away with bad stuff? And of course, most of the reputable companies say, no, no, we don't work like that at all. If Coca-Cola is going to build a bottling plant, they're just going to use the same blueprints, whether they build it in California or Sichuan or in India. And the environmental negative effects are going to be the same in any place. And since they have to work in California or they have to work in France, they're just going to build all of their plants to the same standard. And there's some evidence that US and European and Japanese companies, when they do invest or team up with Chinese companies, they really do hold themselves to the same standards that they would here. But there are certain industries that are just dirtier than others. Car batteries are particularly bad. Anything involving smelting that has lead or other heavy metals. And they just get harder and harder to do in countries with higher environmental standards. So they tend to move to these other countries. About 10 years ago, I reviewed a paper that was finding that when Chinese companies invested in other countries, so direct foreign investment from China out into the world, that they furthered that they tended to move their dirtier industries out of China into other places, and that was a cause for concern. But just this last month, I had a paper from a colleague who said, well, interestingly enough, that's changed. And when China invests in, say, a coal-fired energy plant, and they're investing a bunch in India and Southeast Asia, those plants are cleaner than the ones built by companies in those countries. So they're bringing a higher Chinese environmental standard and just keeping that standard as they invest elsewhere. So it's not all bad news when China's involved. And for a country that faced a lot of resource constraints and has gone through a kind of dirty environmental development process, things are on the upswing. But nevertheless, there is a difference. In fact, just looking back to this morning, towards the end of Clay's presentation, we had a graph of the Asia Society's economic dashboard, and there were two areas where China had made positive progress, and one of them was environmental protection, and then another was trade. So those areas still are important, I think, domestically important politically in China. So not all bad news there. Even if every country had the same environmental standards as we think about moving production from one country to another, there is a displacement of whatever environmental harm there was going to be to that country. So even if the effluents are kept to a minimum or the pollution, or even if the impact on land use, the land we're going to clear, and convert from one use to another is the same. It's just happening somewhere else. So if we get half of our sort of daily use items, pens and paper and plastic dishware and so forth, from China instead of from here, we have spared ourselves the dealing with the environmental implications of that, and we've just said, okay, you deal with that. So even if it's not a difference in policy, there is that displacement that we might want to keep an eye on as we trace the movement of goods across the globe. So in my class, and I commend this to you, we read this book, Pietro Rivoli's Travels of a T-shirt in a Global Economy. Anybody seen this one before? Or you may have heard, if you're familiar with the NPR podcast Planet Money, where they attempted to replicate this exact thing. And the book is exactly what she says it is. She's an economist from Washington, D.C., and she goes on vacation and buys a T-shirt. That's her in the lower left corner there, and reads the tag on it, says made in China, and wonders, well, where did this come from exactly? And I'm an economist, I should know how this works. And so she tells the story more or less from the T-shirt's point of view. She first goes to the company that printed the silkscreen on and asks, where did you buy the blank shirt? And they said, oh, it's this supplier in Shanghai. She goes to Shanghai and says, well, I'm trying to trace this back. Where did you get the cotton from? And the guy says, Texas. And she says, oh, okay, is that near here? And he said, no, Texas, which you know is Chinese for Texas, right? So, oh, okay, so back across the Pacific, and in the upper left-hand corner here goes to the part of Texas that is a major cotton producer. And at this point in the class, I remind my students in Oakland that California is also a major cotton producer, even though climatologically we have no business producing a lot of cotton. We don't have a lot of water, we don't, climate's bad, but we have a lot of innovation, and in California the rule is water flows uphill towards money. So we fund a lot of cotton production in the Central Valley. If you ever drive down I-5, you might actually see some of the tufts of cotton coming off the trucks and sticking to the grill of your car. So it could have been California, but it was Texas where the raw cotton comes from. She traces the links from the cotton farm to the mill, where it's baled up and shipped to China, where then in Shanghai it's first spun into thread and then woven into fabric and then finally cut into the shape of a T-shirt and sewn together. Then it gets, it's not on the map, but it actually gets sent to Florida, where they put on that lovely bird there. She buys it, maybe she wears it for a while, and then when she decides she's done with it, what happens next? And so she does what a lot of us do. I'm cleaning out my garage this summer, and take a bag of old clothes to Goodwill or to a place that'll accept your old clothes. U.S. Donates fantastic amounts of rather good quality clothing into this market. And some of it gets recirculated here, some of it gets is picked up as high value, and you know, stories that American jeans sell for hundreds of dollars in Japan and things like that are true, but not really a big part of it. A big portion of it gets sent to Africa, where the secondhand clothing market has arisen as sort of a minor but consequential part of the economy. And that's what happens to her T-shirt, and she actually goes and finds a secondhand T-shirt dealer and talks to him about what this means for his livelihood and economy. So she was interested in the people and the economics and the tariffs and so forth. And in passing, more than in passing, she covers the environmental issues that come up. And I direct my class to spend a little bit more time with those. And then, as I said, to pick a product of their own that they want to follow in a similar fashion. So when we think about environmental impacts that you might be looking for, you can split these up in different ways, but at each stage you might look for any of these four. So there's extraction of a natural resource, and what are the impacts associated from that? If it's a metal, if it's a mineral resource, is there petroleum involved? How do we get it out of the ground? How much of the ground do we have to disturb to get it out? If it's farming, do we have to clear land that was used for something else? If it's mining, are we digging a big hole? One rule of thumb that came up is that if we're talking about building a building, every building we see that's this big probably produced a hole in the ground about that big somewhere else. Because not only are there, we have a steel beam here that's holding up the roof, but there was a lot more rock and ore and other things that had to be dug up to get that much steel out. So think about every building you've been in and imagine somewhere on the earth there was a hole that big. Then we have to transport that stuff somewhere. How do we do that? By truck, by ship, by rail, by people carrying it on their backs. A lot of that, maybe almost all of that at this point, is fossil fuel driven. And that's one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions. Airline traffic in particular is the fastest growing sector in terms of carbon emissions globally. And we don't, we may see, you see on the freeways around here a lot more electric cars than you used to, but electric airplanes are a long way off. You imagine the battery that you need to fly a plane. So that's going to be carbon dependent for an awfully long time. And some of the high value items that we buy, including our little phones and things, are now flying across the Pacific so they can get here in time for Apple's next product announcement. They don't even want to wait for the month or so that it's going to take to get a container ship across the Pacific. So there's an environmental impact there. You can actually even trace it back to the impact of digging up the petroleum and refining it in the first place. Then there's manufacturing, the actual process. Do we have to heat stuff up? Do we have to turn machinery? Do we, in the process of refining something, what happens to the stuff we don't want, the effluent? For students who were interested in pharmaceutical products or anything to do with metal, there were a lot of different things that come out of the process there. So what happens to that? Into the air, into the soil, into the water. And then, I didn't put up here, but using it, is there any effect of using the device? So some of them you've got to fuel up or charge up or on a daily basis. And then finally, you're going to get rid of it someday. You're going to be done with it. What happens then? Is it something that you can take all the pieces and recycle? Is there anything that can be composted? Is it going to go and have a second life in another market, like the T-shirt we followed to Africa? Is it going to end up in a landfill, and where is that landfill, and who manages that landfill for the generations it'll take for that to biodegrade, if indeed it will biodegrade at all? So we're going to try to keep these in mind, these four basic areas, as we move along. To frame them a different way, we're going to think a bit about land use. How does the land get changed? We're going to think about pollution, stuff that gets emitted into the air that doesn't otherwise belong there, air, soil, water. We're going to think about energy consumption, and then we're going to think about social change or displacement of people from one place or one kind of life to another, and maybe health impacts along the way. So sort of framing those four in these other different ways. So I have two basic websites that I send my students to, and they often use these as leaps to other resources to research. But are you familiar with Alibaba? Have you heard of that company? Yeah. So anyone go to the 99 Ranch Markets ever? They have the best noodles and stuff? Okay. And now at the checkout counter, there's a little sign there that there are 3 words you need to know in Chinese. There's ni hao, there's xie xie, and there's Alipay. So you can pay with your account on Alibaba. But of course, they started as this platform for suppliers, small factories across China, to let the world know we've got this product and we can sell it to you. Really at the essence of globalization is this idea that you're going to have specializations in lots of different places, and they can connect efficiently online, and they say, okay, well, I need this many tons or this many widgets, and you can produce it by this date and get it to this location for this cost. So I've gone on there, and for an example, I've pulled up the town of Zoping in Shandong province, which happens to be where I did my dissertation fieldwork, but a lot of American researchers have gone through Zoping over the years. I suppose it was really the first American research site outside of a major city that was opened up in the discussions between President Carter and Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s, early 80s. And so when I got there, they had a whole office set up to deal with American researchers coming through. And they said something about, and if we came to you, you'd have an office set up to welcome our researchers. And I said, I don't think we have that in San Mateo County, but maybe. So Zoping, it's a little bit south of the Yellow River. Used to be a 6-hour drive from the capital, Jinan, and now it's less than an hour on the superhighway that's been built through. You can see across the map there going just south of the hill at the center of town. So I went on Alibaba just to see what kind of companies they have, and there are a bunch of them. You can search Alibaba for Zoping or your favorite place, or you can search by product. And so for today, how many people actually have Google Earth up at this point? So I'm going to suggest we follow one of the projects that my students picked, and it wasn't terribly surprising, was an iPhone or a MacBook that a lot of them had. And they thought, well, let's see where the parts of that come from. Some of the other products that they chose, one I liked was nice and simple. It was just oolong tea. Where does it get cut and dried? That was sort of a direct, what do you trade China for? We'll start with tea. We've been doing that for a long time. Others picked a Sharpie pen and realized it's got a plastic body, it's got ink, it's got felt, which comes from wool, which comes from sheep, which also come from Shandong province. And then one student had started a side business. She was a K-pop fan and would design little enamel pins with her favorite K-pop stars. And then she went searching and found that you can find enamel pin manufacturers in China who will happily make you a small batch of pins. And so she found where they were actually located and where they get the enamel from and so forth. But we'll start with this, and then as time permits, we might do some others. So for the iPhone or for the MacBook, the first place to start, we decided, would be the case. And the MacBook case is an aluminum shell, right? So you got to make some aluminum, you've got to dig some bauxite out of the ground. And there are just a few places in the world that produce that in large quantities. And at the time, the largest producer was, may still be, Australia. And so if we have you go to Google Earth, and there was something I was going to say about land use. I think I'll come back to that as we go. Have you go to, in Google Earth, search for Mapoon, M-A-P-O-O-N, in Queensland, Australia, and see what you can find there. And I'm going to try, can ask the AV folks to shift me over to Google Earth. Okay. And as I said, so I'm going to be using Google Earth up here on the Chrome browser, which is what some of you may have. You can get a bit more functionality for your class if it's feasible to download the Google Earth program, Google Earth Pro, which works on PCs and Macs. And you can even do it on a phone here. I've got Mapoon queued up on my Google Earth app here too. So this happens to be one of the larger mines in Australia, is located in this area. And you might say, I can't see that at all, but can I zoom in here? I may need to be over here, so if that's okay. All right, thanks. All right, so general idea with Google Earth is you've got a digital map of the globe comprised of satellite images and aerial photos that were all stitched together in a more or less seamless fashion. And then they've labeled it with place names and even down to street addresses, as many places as they can get. And so my students did some research and found that there's this large aluminum mine or bauxite mine in Mapoon, and they didn't get a street address, but they said, well, it's 5 kilometers south of this river here. And if you zoom in, you can see this suspiciously straight road coming down from the Chardon River. And down at the bottom here, we have a big hole in the ground. And I think a little airstrip there to get the executives in and out. And cut into basically a rainforest, right? We're in northern Queensland, on the edge of the tropics there. And so you can see we've got a hole, we've got some an area that's been used for industrial work. We've got some tailing ponds or something like that for the wastewater that gets pumped out. And then we've got some suspicious other lines cut into the ground or into the rainforest around here that I'm guessing are from past mining that has been reforested. And so Australia actually has pretty good rules for cleaning up industrial waste and mining activities. So you can mine for a while, but when you're done with that mine site, you got to put it back as best you can the way it was before. So here's where we start on that journey of where the bauxite comes out of the ground. And then there are a number of places where that bauxite might be sent to be turned into aluminum. It might stay in Australia, but just out of a bit of a China bias, and because I found that there's actually a factory that does this in the county of Zoping, where I did my research, I'm going to have us go there next. So if you're on Google Earth, you can go over to the search bar here and type in Zoping, and then Shan. Okay, and let's see if it takes us somewhere close there. And it's kind of a neat effect because it's going to fly us there. Okay. All right, so there's Changshan town. It's going to spin us around a little bit. And all of a sudden, instead of being in the rainforest, we're in a fairly rapidly developing urban landscape with, just on the edge of it, the intense agriculture that you expect in North China. Actually, I forgot to do this on the first one, but while we're here, go ahead and make a bookmark out of this one by clicking that little bookmark tag over there. And this is going to save this on your computer. It might ask you if you're willing to let it do that. And we'll just bookmark each of these as we go. For their final presentation, what I have my students do is fly us through the path that they've charted and talk at each stage about what the environmental and social impacts would be. So we've got a bookmark. We're going to save that. And I'll allow it. Yep. OK. So we're in the right town, in the right county, but my students were able to do a bit more research on where the actual factory was that processes bauxite and turns out aluminum ingots. And when we looked in the neighborhood, we pretty soon figured out why that factory is there. So if you can scroll a little bit to the north. Can I scroll? There we go. So the address for the factory is in Qianhuai Cun, or Qianhuai Village. And if you see those 4 cooling towers lined up right here, there's a huge coal-fired electric generating facility right there. And so they're as close as they can be to cheap electric power, and that's the thing you need to make aluminum. So, and I think the factory is just over across the street. So we're going to imagine that the bauxite gets shipped here, gets put on rail cars, probably at the port of Qingdao. We could add that to our map, and gets sent here, turned into aluminum ingots, sort of a standard commodity. And this is a chance for me to pause and say, yeah, I know that's not exactly the very piece of aluminum that goes into your MacBook. And this is what we're going to find out, which is the same thing that Pietro Rivoli found out about the cotton in her T-shirt, is that in today's global commodity market, you can't trace one thing all the way through. Things get combined, things get, whoever was the highest or lowest bidder on a given day gets tossed into the pool, and people pull out of that pool. So when Planet Money, the podcast, they actually went to Texas and tried to buy a bale of cotton and then sell it on into to get it produced into a T-shirt. And they're like, no, it doesn't work that way. You buy a bale of cotton, you get money for it. And then over here, you pull out a bale of cotton, and it's not the same one when you want to make a T-shirt. So we're, and the students generally get this. We're trying to illustrate the representative path as best we can, even though we know that there are a lot of other paths that it could be. Question?
If you were trying to show students how you figured out that there's a plant in China that does the how did you do that research? How did you model it?
Okay, so Alibaba was the site, and they dug down deep enough to get a street address or a village address, something like that, yeah. Sometimes you can get it just from that one jump, and then the students are clever if it says just the name of the county but not the address. They can do some other Google searching and be sort of brave about when they get websites that turn up in Chinese and say, okay, Google Translate will work with that. We're just trying to get an address, a postal code, some clue, And then when you look on the map, look around, and sometimes it's the only thing for miles around in the field. It's like, okay, that's the factory. This is what brings me back. I'll shift back now that we've seen some of the landscape to how to interpret these aerial maps, because some people do this sort of intuitively, or they've been working with Google Earth or Google Maps for all their life, but I want to think about, okay, well, what do things look like from the sky? And there are three interesting land use patterns in China that you'll see as you go through this exercise. Starting from the bottom, the older settlements from the 80s or prior, sort of natural settlements, tend to be smaller buildings, smaller grain to them, and less of a geometric feel. I mean, you can sort of see that there's an alley going through here and courtyard houses and so forth. Fewer of the blue roofs, which are either metal or solar panels, and less shadows because they're not as tall. And then you get from the period of the 50s through the 80s this work unit housing associated with factories or offices. And they tend to be sort of apartment blocks all lined up, but not quite as with the eye to aesthetics, sometimes called Stalinist architecture, right? And then at the top, the newest kinds of developments and the sort of most high value are these, they call them super blocks of development that are designed much more with an eye to aesthetics, sometimes with characteristic Western or Chinese architectural styles. And you'll see these patterns like circles and swoops and birds seen from the air and so forth. Often, again, also high-rise as well. And in these blocks, sometimes as big as a kilometer square. So as you're zooming over the landscape in Zoping or wherever it is, and you see these different clusters, the middle of the town might look more like this if it hasn't been torn down and redeveloped. You'll see this around some of the older factories in the towns that had industry earlier on, and then the new gated communities that have sprung up more recently since that. Another pattern you'll see is the interface of agricultural land and these newer developments. And so it's a fair assumption anywhere in eastern China that if there's agricultural land next to what you're seeing, that say this power plant, that before the power plant was there, it was agricultural land as well. Pretty much every flat piece of land and some of the not so flat pieces of land were intensively cultivated not that long ago. So here we go, a little village that's not so developed, just across some fields from this power plant. Okay, in the time that's remaining, our next stop, back to this one, iPhone City. So we talked about Foxconn this morning being the major producer for Apple and a lot of the other tech companies. It's a Taiwanese firm that set up shop in Taiwan and then in Shenzhen and now is spread. So if you'll search in Google Earth for Foxconn Zhengzhou Science Park, we'll go there next. All right, we're going to fly out of Shandong province into, was it Henan? Zhengzhou, and we get a little tour there, and we probably need to zoom out to get appreciate just how big we're looking at. I'm going to bookmark this, so it'll be on our tour. And say done. And I want to zoom out here. All right, this is a heck of a big factory. It just keeps going. And it's not even really in Zhengzhou. It's on the outskirts of the city, which we're going to see out here a ways. So there's Zhengzhou proper up to the northwest. But the other thing we'll see right just to the south of the Zhengzhou Science Park is the new international airport. And about half of the iPhones made in the world are made in this one facility. As of last time anyone would, Apple's kind of closed-lipped about this sort of thing, but as far as we know. And there's a good chance that if you have one, it got on a plane here, an A380 or something like that, and flown across the Pacific to LA and then into the distribution network so that it could be ready for the next announcement of a new product, something like that. So Obviously, Apple's very concerned about people not getting an advanced look at their products, but also getting them out. So there's a lot of security around who can see which parts and who gets to put them together at the end, and then how quickly they can get on that plane and over here. So my students would be mapping first the development of this facility on what was mostly agricultural land, but probably given the pattern and the distribution of villages, there were probably a fair number of villages that were cleared out of the way to make room for this, both the science park and the airport facility. And then we might think, okay, what's the land use change there? Again, what's the social displacement or the health issues going along with that? What's the increased energy consumption and so forth? All right, so we're going to assume that the next stop on this, it's flown across the Pacific. We could map the airports. We could map the transportation network in California. But I think the nearest Apple store to here is up the road at the Hillsdale Shopping Center. So we're going to search for that next. All right, so here we're going to fly. And for other products, we might be, say, going to the nearest port and thinking about the Port of Long Beach or the Port of Oakland. And then trucks or however it's going to be. I think the Apple Store is actually over in that part of the mall, but close enough for our purposes. A little bit different land use pattern that you see around here. You can think about the difference is both culturally and policy-wise about expectations about zoning and what kind of things we build where, who gets to be next to who else, the size of the houses that people live in, and so forth. And I actually have them mapped to where they are now, so they might be mapping to their dorm room or our classroom, but I'll have us mapped to where we are today, 101 Twin Dolphin Drive in Redwood City. And at that point, some of the students will put in their own picture or picture of the classroom or something like that. If we were going to, when you're done with your phone or your device and it's lived its useful life, in San Mateo, you might just put it in a recycling bin. And where would that go? And so I'm going to bookmark this and then go to the Shoreway Recology Center. I think I can get it here. Recology San Mateo, which happens to be just down the street here. And at this point, until a year or two ago, the students probably would have traced the aluminum or the plastic or the paper that they're recycling back to China, because huge amounts of American goods travel back to China and were put back into a productive system, some of them. Turns out a lot of them were just piling up there or getting dumped into the river and so forth, because it wasn't economically viable. And then, as you probably heard, China said, well, we're going to stop doing this. And they greatly raised the standards for what kind of waste materials they would accept from the US and other trading partners. So at this point, this year, we don't go back to China across the Pacific. And the chances are that it's going to go to a place like this. So let's look for the Ox Mountain landfill. And that's over the hill on the way to Half Moon Bay. So we've got some green space there. And down this canyon is where San Mateo disposes of most of its trash. And increasingly, some of its recyclable materials, because we can't get rid of it any other way. So I'm going to zoom out here again just to see what we're looking at. We're just a few miles from the ocean in a fairly verdant part of the county, but tucked away there is where the trash goes. And I want students to make that full connection that, of the lifespan of what they buy. They're going to buy another iPhone or another MacBook, but the one that they are done with is still somewhere, conservation of matter and energy, right? So it still exists, and it's going to exist into the indefinite future. Okay, so what I'm hoping we'll take away from this, what my students will take away from this, and what you might, is the sense of the scale of the global supply chain and the sense of that everything comes from somewhere and has an impact at each point along the way. The Google Earth Tour helps illustrate that and sort of prods the students to think about those places and think that there are real people down there and there are trees and there our sheep making the wool for the Sharpie pens and so forth, and tally up all of those different impacts. I have to just change one more slide, and then perhaps we can have a discussion or some questions about how you'd implement that. All right, so there's our tour for this one product. So just to have in mind, through each of those steps, each of those places, what the impacts were. And I'd be really happy with my college students if they turned this into a table, if they added illustrations, maybe some pictures on the ground, street view, or so forth. On the disposal side, the organization called the Basel Action Network, which is concerned about international waste trade, did some very interesting investigation of what the recycling facilities in China were like, and more recently, this book by Anna Laura Wainwright about what it's like to live in some of the villages that were the hub of the electronic recycling industry, bearing some of the environmental burden of, say, burning off the plastic to get at the copper and so forth. Why the Chinese government is not so thrilled about having that being a major industry, but why the people there, depending on the income from it, are not so happy about the ban either. So thinking through this and maybe become a little more aware in their own choices, conscious when they throw something away that it isn't really going away. That wouldn't be a bad place to end. And also feeling connected to, when it says made in China, that's a real place, a real thing, and they might go there. All right, so am I just on time to take some questions or discuss more, or maybe get suggestions from any of you how this might actually play out in your classes at whichever level your students are?
Let's start by thanking Mark for a wonderful. So very, very quickly, one of the things you were talking about was this environmental impact and the question of outsourcing pollution. And I don't know if your students have tried to do that, because the skies in America may be a little bit cleaner than they once were, partly because so much of the dirty manufacturing is offshore. And one of the things that we hear a lot about is that dislocation and the extent to which you and your students have been able to explore that. But also the question now, we have Japan cutting off supplies of chemicals to South Korea to make semiconductors because they're unhappy with certain things, and now South Koreans are boycotting Japanese products and all of that kind of thing. And we've heard about rare earths and those issues. Mm-hmm. Can you say something about that, about how fragile this incredible just-in-time manufacturing has become?
Yeah, on the one hand, it's brilliant, but on the other hand, it just-in-time multiplies the number of vulnerabilities where if something breaks, the whole system grinds to a halt. The rare earths come up in terms of cell phones, and I'm going to forget what the rare earth is that you need in every cell phone, but there are at least a couple. China produces some of it domestically, but not as much as they import from, I want to say, West Africa, in some areas that have been subject to conflicts. In the US, we get skittish about doing trade with those countries and say, oh, we won't do it, but we still are quite happy to import the iPhones that have it in them at a later stage in the process. China's been, as a national policy, like, trade is good, and your internal problems are your internal problems and can be just meet at the border and pick up the rare earths. So yeah, that definitely came up. One of my student groups tried to find the mines in Africa and talked a bit about regional conflicts there, and I'm not going to do that justice. Actually had a wonderful class with the Africa Studies professor at Mills, where we combined our two classes for the day and had that conversation. Pointing out that it's less of a stretch than you might think to compare the country of China and the continent of Africa. There are a lot more countries in Africa, but there's actually more people in China in terms of size and natural resources and things. There are some natural complementarities there that China is quite happy to build those ties and help develop so that the supplies keep flowing the iPhone and all the other production lines don't break down for lack of a critical ingredient. We might be a little skittish about that.
No, a great description of how complicated and how engaged all of us are in this mix. One of my, so you know about the iPhones and all that sort of thing. One of the things that fascinates me is they're actually manufacturing hotels in China and sending them to the United States. Citizen M branded hotels. They send the rooms all built with the plumbing and all that stuff, comes in, and they assemble them, stack them up. So all kinds of things get made. We have a bunch of questions, so let's get to some of them. This gentleman had one.
Professor, along this
There you go,
activity
Mike. Yeah.
that you're doing with your students, do you have you had students trace the value added to the product? And you mentioned just briefly the social concerns at some of these levels. Elaborate on what you see.
So I think those are both really good ideas, and that an economics class really would want to trace that. The closest we get is looking at the tariffs in terms of the value added. What tariffs get imposed as the components get brought into different countries, and gets them to explore the massively complicated U.S. tariff code, differences between rainproof and not rainproof jackets. And one of the reasons that many of my students are wearing flip-flops that don't have a strap around the back is that strap turns it into a sandal, which has a tariff at a completely different level. One of my students did pillow pets. Do you all know pillow pets? They're like stuffed animals, but you unfold them and they're a pillow, and it's kind of cute. And their slogan used to be, is it a pillow or is it a pet? And it turns out that distinction is in the tariff code. If it's a stuffed animal, there's no tariff, but if there's a pillow, there's a tariff. And so some clever pillow manufacturing company in Taiwan said, well, if we put some eyes and stripes on it, we can sell it to the US without a tariff. So it creates a new industry. And then, of course, the Chinese market just knocks that off immediately, and then we get a proliferation of pillow pets. All my students were familiar with pillow pets. So the tariff part of the value add is certainly in there, and I do have them go, check off, how's this product going to be classified by the time it hits the Port of Long Beach or the Port of Oakland. Now the social impact, yeah, that is a big part of our class and also a big part of Rivoli's book. Who works in these factories? Why do they work there? And we're going to hear a bit about migrant worker protections and that issue in China. It's an important one. But Rivoli makes the point that it is, to the extent probably we don't appreciate it, a fairly free labor market in China for people to decide that they want to go work in a factory instead of staying on the farm. And they make a choice that it's economically or socially or for their family better to up and migrate to factories to seek that kind of work rather than, say, staying in agricultural labor. One example was a Japanese research team of sociologists had been going to the Yangtze River Delta and interviewing farmers for years, and they came back in the early 2000s and they couldn't find any more farmers because people had made the choice to switch. So yes, there are important issues about the social control of that and the exposure to pollution and so forth, but it's also an economic opportunity that people are taking. And then as we saw the rise in income over the past decade or two, it is truly remarkable. And that's a side of China's economic growth that has been shared. Though interestingly, both China and the US have a problem with growing income inequality, which we would also get into that. The factory workers and the factory owners are accelerating their incomes at rather different rates. So, okay.
Yeah, it is stunning that our inequality is very similar. Our Gini coefficient, nudging up and up and up, well over 0.4, right? Mm-hmm. Scary. And so, other questions?
On the Gini coefficient, since you mentioned that's a measure of how unequal income is in a country. Both countries going up, but if we were to merge and create the United States of China and America, that would lower it, right? Because our high and low income and their high and low income sort of cancel out. So anyway,
The law of averages. We had a hand that went up and now it's disappeared? Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
A comment. I teach younger, kids.
How much younger?
My kids are in 8th grade.
8th grade. Okay.
So what I really like about this exercise is that the critical thinking aspect of it, and I can see that I would have a lot of kids with deer in the headlights looks at the critical thinking, and then that I could really use this and adapt it to any subject that I was teaching, as far as a hands-on exercise for critical thinking and to ask questions at each stage, and that once you have your answer, you're not done, that you can keep going.
I love the framing of that, and I think if anything I pass on from this exercise today is you really could adapt this to lots of different levels. At some, it's about the research, but maybe it's about the mapping and the cartography, but at any level, it's about thinking, right? It's like, okay, how do we get this information? How do we think about that? And how do we take what we know and be critical about it? So,
Got another question here.
A couple of the science teachers at my school wanted to try to do some kind of environmental project with the school in China, and they asked me to coordinate it, but I didn't get very far in terms of, figuring out how to do that. I was just wondering if you know of any websites or
and
resources.
what grade are you covering?
High school.
High school.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a tricky thing, and I think the 1990 Institute is probably as good a place as any to start on that. But these sort of collaborations that touch on something that might be sensitive get very hard on the Chinese side for them to follow through with. And even when I go as a guest in China, what it's okay for me to talk about and what they'd really rather I didn't talk about come up. So yeah, the very recent history is okay. You go back a decade or two and we start all of a sudden like, oh wait, we're not supposed to talk about that in that way anymore. Even just in terms of environmental policy, which is a national priority. My dissertation research was, part of it was on the policy to preserve farmland. It was a national policy, everybody agreed on it. But when I started asking like, so that farmland there, was it preserved? It's like, well, yeah. So yeah, I think this would be, it would be hard to have Americans draw attention to a Chinese environmental problem. It might work the other way around though. So even though I spent my graduate years studying China, when I go there, actually, I get a lot more questions about the US. How do they do that in California? When did California adopt this law? And so I have to study up a little bit on our side. So maybe the issue is that, like, what's something that we have in common? Can we measure our air quality here? And we have to cop up to the terrible air quality with the wildfires or something like that. Maybe that's a starting point that makes it more equal.
Yeah, no, that's a terrific point. And in fact, one of the safe things is to, I show slides of Los Angeles in the 40s and in the 60s and even in the 80s. And we still have, of course, bad days. And it's really stunning. So much so that in the 1940s, researchers at USC were pioneering not just masks, but spacesuits, to cope with it. And the problem for the Chinese side is that civic action was involved in making these demands and continues to be involved. And of course, we have a federal system and tensions between California and the United States over those kinds of emissions. But it is interesting. What can you do? Maybe it's possible with a partner school where you're already doing something else and they trust you. But if you go in and you say, I'd really like to know about your cancer village, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
That's going to be a problem. But we've had a lot of students, including students in science classes, because so much environmental data is now available from China via the web, especially through the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs. You can get information about water pollution. You can get information about air quality, things like that. And they can map it and do that. So we've had people who have focused on Wuhan, for example, and tracked that. It's not interactive. They're not interacting with students from those places, but it might be possible. But actually, there's nothing more, the two sensitive topics, three sensitive,
Well, there would be
it's it's a long list, but three quick ones, right? Number one, environment. gigantic because of the protests over chemical plants and things like that, but also land. Mark just talked about what happened to the farmland, and local governments finance everything by selling farmland to developers to turn it into something else, okay? And there are those protests, those kinds of NIMBY protests as well. So you have those, and I promised you a third, and I lost it, except that could you do this with your students in China? No. Why? Oh, no, you can take your students, you can talk about every one of these things. Here's the challenge. No Google Earth.
Yeah, no Google.
Okay. Yeah, no Google generally. With the VPN, it's still too glacially slow to do stuff with Google Earth. But that's why your kids will know Pokemon Go, ancient history. I did that when I was in elementary school. Pokemon Go, that augmented reality. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, augmented reality. Because it depended on Google Maps, it didn't work in China until what? Somebody figured out how to make it work with maps from Los Angeles. So you had students in Shanghai tooling around looking for the Pokemon stuff, right?
I'm getting a desperate signal that we're out of time. Is that right? Yeah, we are. Okay. I'm happy to stay around. I'm happy to talk by email, mhenderson@mills.edu, either on the China side or any of your bright students who might be considering a liberal arts education in Northern California, a rare and special thing. And I'd love to hear your ideas going forward as if you take any of these into your classroom. Let me know how it goes. My ideal would be that in a few years I get one of your students who's done this project who then shows up in my class and tells us how to do it better. So,
doing it in a different way. Friends, we need to thank Mark, but before you do that, I'd like to push something else he didn't talk about. But the question of regions of China, China is a diverse place. It's fascinating, it's huge, it's diverse. And Mark has put together for Oxford Bibliographies this collection of resources about China's regions. Take advantage of that. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Mark for a wonderful presentation.